July 30th, 2004. A federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Joseph Massino, boss of the Bonanno crime family, the last sitting boss of any New York family not already in prison, has just been convicted on all 11 counts. 7 murders. Racketeering. The full weight of what the government had spent years building. He's looking at life. And then a separate trial, already scheduled, already loaded, for an 8th murder. One that carries the death penalty. The room empties, and Joseph Massino asks to speak with the judge. What he says next has never happened before in the history of the American Mafia. Not once. Not in 70 years of federal prosecution of the 5 families. Not after Rico. Not after the commission trial. Not after Donnie Brasco. Not after Sammy Gravano. A sitting boss, the official head of one of the 5 families, tells the government he will cooperate. Fully. Completely. Against everyone. Joseph Massino, the man Time magazine had called the last Don, the only full boss of a New York family not already serving time, became the first in history to cross that line. And here is what makes this more than just a betrayal story. Massino didn't flip despite everything he believed. He flipped because of everything he believed. The same cold calculation that had built the most disciplined criminal organization in New York. The same mind that had rebuilt a family destroyed by an FBI infiltration, banned his men from social clubs, forbidden them from saying his name, and designed a structure specifically engineered to prevent exactly this moment. Looked at a death penalty and made the same calculation he had always made. Survival first, everything else second. The code of silence he had enforced with murder for 30 years was never a principle. It was a tool, and the moment it stopped serving him, he put it down. To understand why that calculation felt not just possible but inevitable, you need to understand what Massino built, and what it cost to build it. Maspeth, Queens. 1963. A teenager drops out of high school and starts running numbers from a lunch truck. Not because it was the only option, because he was already calculating which path moved fastest toward the kind of power he intended to have. Joseph Massino understood money before he understood anything else. The lunch truck became a front. The numbers operation became a crew. The crew became a hijacking operation that drew the attention of the Bonanno family and put Massino on the path to becoming one of the most feared men in New York, organized crime. He befriended a fellow hijacker in those early years, a man named John Gotti. They came up together. They would end very differently. By the late 1970s, Massino was a rising force inside the Bonanno family, earning, building relationships, demonstrating the 2 qualities that separate men who climb from men who stall. He could make money, and he was willing to kill. May 5th, 1981, a social club in Brooklyn. 3 Bonanno capos, Alphonse Indelicato, Philip Giacone, Dominic Trinchera, arrive for a meeting they believe is routine. Massino had received intelligence that the 3 men were stockpiling automatic weapons and planning to wipe out the Rastelli loyalists and seize control of the family. He moved first. 4 gunmen hidden in a closet. When the 3 capos walked in, they were shot to death. Massino personally stopped Indelicato from escaping. Vito Rizzuto, the Montreal mob boss, was one of the gunmen. The triple murder established Massino's position inside the family more clearly than anything else could. He was not a man who waited for permission when the calculation required action. Then came the loose end. Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, a capo who had unknowingly vouched for an FBI agent, a man named Joseph Pistone, who had spent 6 years inside the Bonanno family under the name Donnie Brasco. 6 years. 100 convictions from a single undercover operation. The most damaging infiltration in the history of the American Mafia. Napolitano had sponsored Brasco, had pushed for him to be made, had trusted him completely. Massino's verdict was simple. He told his brother-in-law Salvatore Vitale that Napolitano needed to receive the receipt for the Donnie Brasco situation. Napolitano was murdered in the summer of 1982. His body found in a shallow grave when heavy rains uncovered it months later. Massino went into hiding in Pennsylvania to avoid the federal net closing around the Bonannos. He surrendered 2 years later. Convicted of labor racketeering in 1987, sentenced to 10 years. While he was in prison, his mentor Philip Rastelli died. Massino was released in 1992 as the undisputed boss of the Bonanno crime family. And what he did next, with a family in ruins, expelled from the commission, infiltrated, convicted, humiliated, is what earned him the title they eventually gave him, The Last Don, 1992. The Bonanno family is the most damaged organization in New York organized crime. Donnie Brasco had been inside for 6 years. The commission had expelled them, the only family ever removed from the table that governed the American Mafia. Their membership was decimated. Their reputation was destroyed. Their leadership had spent the better part of a decade in federal custody. Massino looked at what remained and started building. But not the way the other families built. Not with social clubs and public profiles, and the kind of visible power that made a boss feel like a boss. He had watched what visibility did. He had watched Donnie Brasco sit inside a family for 6 years because the men around him were too comfortable, too open, too willing to let someone in. He had watched the commission trial convict bosses whose conversations had been recorded in their own headquarters. He had watched John Gotti, his old friend from the hijacking days, turn himself into the most famous criminal in America. And he had understood exactly what that meant. Gotti wasn't powerful because he was visible. He was vulnerable because he was visible. So Massino built the opposite. No social clubs, he closed them. Every other family still operated from fixed locations. Storefronts, back rooms, clubs where the FBI could park outside and document everything. Massino eliminated the fixed locations. No names. Members were forbidden from saying his name. When they needed to refer to him, they touched their ear. Not a coincidence that Gigante's men touched their chin. Both men had arrived at the same conclusion through different paths. The boss whose name cannot be spoken on a wire is the boss who cannot be convicted on a wire. Meetings were held in remote locations, out of state, in moving cars, in places that could be passed off as vacations if anyone was watching. The structure itself was deliberately decentralized. Crews operating with limited knowledge of what other crews were doing. Members knowing only what they needed to know to do their specific job. By the early 2000s, the results were visible. The Bonanno family, the organization that had been the laughingstock of New York organized crime a decade earlier, was the second most powerful family in the city, behind only the Genovese. Time magazine put Massino on their radar. The Last Don, the only full boss of a 5 family not currently serving a prison sentence. The FBI called him the most powerful mafia boss in the United States. While Gotti rotted in a cell, and the Colombos tore themselves apart, and the Lucchese's cooperated their way into irrelevance, Massino was earning. Building, invisible, Everything he had designed was working. And then the thing no organizational design can fully prevent began to happen. The men inside the structure started making decisions of their own. The last dawn. The FBI had been watching for years. Not with wiretaps in social clubs that no longer existed. Not with surveillance on fixed locations Messino had closed. With forensic accounting, following money, tracing the financial architecture of an organization specifically designed to leave no trail. It was slower, more methodical, less dramatic than a wire kitting a boss saying the wrong thing in the wrong room. But it was working. In 2002, the first crack appeared. 2 Bonanno captains became cooperating witnesses. Not soldiers, not associates. Captains. The first made members in Bonanno family history to ever cooperate with law enforcement. In a family that had prided itself on the code, on Messino's specific, deliberate, enforced version of the code, 2 captains walked into federal buildings and started talking. Their cooperation triggered others. Consigliere Richard Cantarilla flipped, then a 3rd made member, then a 4th. Each defection made the next one more likely, because each man who flipped could potentially implicate the men around him, which meant the men around him now had a reason to flip first. The structure Messino had spent a decade building was beginning to eat itself. January 9, 2003, Messino arrested. Comprehensive RICO indictment, 7 murders, racketeering. The full architecture of his criminal career laid out in federal charges. Denied bail. Vincent Basciano, a Bronx captain, took over as acting boss in his absence. And then came the one that mattered most. Salvatore Vitale, Messino's brother-in-law, his underboss, and the man who had been beside him from the lunch truck to the boardroom of American organized crime. 30 years. Vitale had pleaded guilty to loan sharking charges in June of 2002. His maximum sentence was low enough that Messino had wrongly suspected he was already cooperating. That suspicion had poisoned the relationship between the 2 men in the months before the arrest. Vitale knew it, and Vitale made his calculation. He flipped. And when Salvatore Vitale took the witness stand at Messino's trial in the summer of 2004, he didn't just testify about 1 murder or 1 conspiracy. He covered 30 years of criminal history in a single courtroom appearance. Every murder, every order, every conversation he had been present for across 3 decades of building an empire with the man sitting at the defense table. 6 turned, made men testified against Joseph Messino at that trial. 6, in a family built on the principle that silence was everything. 6 made members took the stand against their own boss. On July 30th, 2004, the jury convicted Messino on all 11 counts, and a separate trial, already scheduled, was waiting. 1 murder. The death penalty. The man who had built the most disciplined family in New York was now facing the possibility that the government would execute him. The calculation that had driven every decision of his life was about to produce its final result. The day after the verdict, Joseph Messino asked to meet with the judge. Not his lawyers. The judge. What he said in that meeting had never been said before by a man in his position. He wanted to cooperate. Fully. Completely. Against everyone. The first official boss of a 5 family in the history of the American Mafia to cross that line. Think about what that means. This was not a soldier facing 10 years deciding the math didn't work. This was not a capo weighing loyalty against a sentence he might survive. This was the man at the top of the structure, the man who had personally overseen the murder of men who cooperated with the government, who had built an entire organization around the principle that silence was non-negotiable, who had watched his own underboss take the stand against him and understood exactly what cooperation looked like from the other side asking for a deal. The death penalty changed the calculation, not the conviction. The conviction meant life. Life was survivable. The death penalty meant the government was prepared to execute him. And Joseph Massino, the same man who had looked at the ruins of the Bonanno family in 1992 and calculated exactly what it would take to rebuild, looked at that number and made a different calculation. He agreed to cooperate. He forfeited $12 million. He pleaded guilty to the 8th murder in 2005 and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Then he went further. Further than any cooperating witness in the history of organized crime had gone before. A Massino agreed to wear a wire inside a federal holding cell. His target, Vincent Basciano, the man he had chosen to run the family in his absence, his own successor. Massino recorded Basciano confessing to ordering a murder. He recorded Basciano plotting to kill a federal prosecutor. Then in 2011, Joseph Massino walked into a federal courtroom in Brooklyn and took the witness stand against the man he had handpicked to carry his organization forward. A prosecutor asked him what powers he had held as boss of the Bonanno family. He answered without hesitation. Murders, responsibility for the family, made captains, break captains. Matter of fact, no drama, no remorse visible in the delivery. The same tone he had used to give those orders for 30 years. When asked why he was cooperating, he gave the only honest answer a man in his position could give. He said he was hoping to see a light at the end of the tunnel, not ideology, not conscience, not a conversion, a calculation. The same calculation that had driven every decision of his life, applied to the one situation his organizational design had been specifically built to prevent. Basciano was convicted, sentenced to life. Multiple Bonanno members convicted on Massino's testimony. The organization he had rebuilt from the wreckage of Donnie Brasco, the family he had made the second most powerful in New York, was now being dismantled from the top down by the man who had built it. By 2013, Massino was sentenced to time served. He walked out of federal custody, supervised release for the rest of his life, when he died on September 14th, 2023, 80 years old, in a rehabilitation clinic in New York. Not in prison, not in a cell, not in the Federal Medical Center where so many of the men he had outlasted had spent their final years. He died outside, which is exactly what the calculation had been designed to produce. Joseph Massino spent 30 years building an organization around one rule: silence above everything. He enforced it with murder. He designed an entire structure around making it as difficult as possible for any member to break it. No social clubs, no fixed locations, no names on wires. Decentralized crews who knew only what they needed to know. And when the pressure finally came, when the death penalty put the ultimate cost on the table, he broke it himself. Not reluctantly, decisively. With the same precision he had applied to every other decision of his criminal career. That is the part most people miss when they tell this story. They frame it as a collapse, a weakness, a betrayal. It was none of those things. It was the system functioning exactly as it was always designed to function, just in a direction nobody inside it had anticipated. Because here is what the Massino story actually reveals about the organizational logic of Cosa Nostra. The code of silence was never a moral commitment. It was an enforcement mechanism. It held as long as the cost of breaking it was higher than the cost of keeping it. The moment a death penalty inverted that equation, for the man most responsible for enforcing the code broke. Not because Messina was weak, because the code was always conditional. Every man inside that structure was making the same calculation every day. Is my silence worth what it costs me? For 30 years, the answer was yes. The moment the answer changed for the man at the top, the man who had built the enforcement mechanism, none who had personally overseen the murder of men who had asked themselves the same question and arrived at a different answer, the entire organizational logic collapsed from the top down. Sammy Gravano was a shock when he flipped against Gotti, an underboss testifying against his boss. Messina was something different. Messina was the proof that there is no position inside a criminal organization that places a man beyond the reach of his own survival instinct. Not capo, not underboss, not boss. The higher the position, the more the man knows, the more he can offer, the better the deal the government can give him, which means the man most incentivized to stay silent is also the man most valuable to the government if he decides not to. That structural contradiction sits at the center of every criminal organization built on enforced loyalty. The Genovese understood it and designed around it, keeping the boss so invisible that even his cooperation would produce limited damage. Messina understood it too. He just arrived at the conclusion from the other side. The last Don didn't break the code because the code failed him. He broke it because the code was always just a calculation. And on July 30th, 2004, the day after a jury convicted him on all 11 counts, the calculation changed. Which criminal organization built its entire survival on preventing exactly this moment? And how close did they come to pulling it off? Drop it in the comments. If this breakdown was worth your time, you can leave a like.